Well, hello again, and welcome to another edition of the Speed Bag. Today, a segment that I like to call, Wait, That Sounds Crazy, but Could It Still Be True? Now, over at BleacherReport.com this week, my friend and colleague Mike Chiappetta has a really good story looking at how some fighters have fared after fighting out their UFC contracts, entering into free agency, and then jumping over to Bellator MMA. It's a good story on an interesting, complex topic, and I recommend that you read it. But the part that struck me came right in the beginning. See, according to former UFC heavyweight Matt Mitrione, he was having a conversation with UFC CEO Lorenzo Fertitta, and Mitrione says that they were talking about particulars surrounding the Reebok deal, which, as you may know, Mitrione was none too pleased with, and he made the point to Lorenzo Fertitta that the fighters, people, in other words, like Mitrione, were the UFC's product, to which Mitrione says Fertitta gave him a quizzical look and said, No, the fighters weren't the product. The show itself, the UFC brand, that was the product. Now, for what it's worth, I reached out to UFC officials to ask about this. They claim that Mitrione's version is, quote, not an accurate representation of the conversation with Lorenzo Fertitta. Exactly how it's inaccurate, they wouldn't say. Wouldn't say if it's a wild mischaracterization, a slight misstatement, which, kind of leaves us back at square one, with Mitrione saying he told Lorenzo Fertitta, fighters are your product, and Lorenzo Fertitta told him, no, not really. At first, that's kind of a tough thing to wrap your head around, right? I mean, it's like saying that what the circus is selling is not clowns and elephants and lion tamers and all that, but the tent that moves from city to city. What's Riverdance without the river dancers? Such as the UFC without the fighters, right? Or is it? Because I'm telling you, this one gets trickier the more you think about it. Because saying that the UFC's product is not the fighters, that's not necessarily the same thing as saying that the UFC could have the exact same product without any fighters. It's more like saying that the UFC's product is not these particular fighters, meaning any of the ones who are under contract to the UFC at any given time. It's kind of like saying that the bulk of the people that the UFC employs are not even remotely irreplaceable. But even then, how could that be, right? There's a reason why Conor McGregor's pay-per-views sell better than Demetrius Johnson's pay-per-views. It's the same reason you couldn't just swap Bethe Correia in for Ronda Rousey and call it good. The UFC's show, the actual lights and production and commentators, all that stuff may be, as Mike Goldberg would say, virtually identical everywhere the UFC goes, but gate receipts and pay-per-view sales, those sure aren't. Individual stars still matter. Who's on the card matters, right? And I think it does to a point. But think about it this way. Think about what UFC President Dana White says every time he recounts being asked by someone, how would the UFC possibly replace Chuck Liddell or George St. Pierre or Brock Lesnar? His answer every single time essentially boils down to someone will come along, because they always do. A star always manages to find a way to emerge to the top, even through the stifling morass of the UFC roster. When you start to think of it in those terms, then Fertitta's point becomes almost diabolically irrefutable. The vast majority of the fighters that the UFC is employing at every time, they're all pretty much replaceable or expendable with a few exceptions. That's because this is not a team sport the way we think of other major sports. You don't need winners at every single position to add up to a win at the end of the season. This is a show. You need a star's name to put on the poster, but other than that, you need a lot of backup dancers. And backup dancers can be subbed in and out with the shining exceptions of a few stars. Meanwhile, the UFC putting on this show is providing hours and hours of live sports programming to TV partners all around the world. Partners who most likely don't draw too big a distinction between, say, Matt Mitrione and Gabriel Gonzaga. Partners who really just want some UFC to put on the TV. It's kind of depressing to think about, isn't it? I think it's depressing. That's just because I can't help but think about how much all those fighters have sacrificed just to get in there. And that's not just the stars who are making the big money. It's everyone who steps in there to fight, everyone who signs a UFC contract. And they sacrifice a lot to get the opportunity, and then they risk a lot when they go in there and do it. But just because it's depressing doesn't mean, from a business sense, that it's untrue. And if you don't think it's true, then ask yourself how many of the fighters just on the main card of the UFC's upcoming Fight Night event from Zagreb, Croatia this weekend that you can name without looking it up. Then think about how odds are you'll probably still watch anyway.